What if I told you that one of the biggest financial disasters in human history started not in Wall Street, not in the age of computers or cryptocurrency, but more than 300 years ago, in a time of powdered wigs, candlelight, and horse-drawn carriages? What if I told you that kings, scientists, and politicians, men who shaped the modern world, were all fooled by a single idea? And what if the very foundation of that idea wasn't trade or production or invention, but illusion? This is the story of the South Sea Bubble, a scandal so massive it nearly bankrupted Britain, destroyed lives, and gave birth to the first true financial bubble. But more importantly, it's a story that reveals something haunting, that human greed, hope, and fear haven't changed in 3 centuries, and that the same mistake keeps repeating, under new names and in new markets. To understand how this madness began, we must travel back to early 18th century Britain, a nation both powerful and desperate. Britain had just emerged from a long and expensive war, the War of the Spanish Succession. Victorious, yes, but broke. The national debt had ballooned to around £50 million, an astronomical sum for the time, roughly equivalent to billions today. The government was suffocating under the weight of interest payments, and taxpayers were furious. Yet out of this chaos, a group of financiers saw an opportunity. Among them was a man named John Blunt, a clever, ambitious, and dangerously persuasive figure who believed he could turn Britain's debt into gold. Blunt wasn't a nobleman or a war hero. He was a salesman, a mathematician, and a visionary, or perhaps more accurately, a manipulator. He had watched what was happening across the Channel in France, where another brilliant but reckless man named John Law had convinced the French government to print paper money backed by shares in a trading company called the Mississippi Company. The idea was simple but seductive. People could buy shares in the company, the value of those shares would rise as the economy grew, and everyone would get rich together. For a short while, it worked. Paris buzzed with speculation. Fortunes were made overnight. And then, inevitably, the illusion collapsed. John Blunt saw both the brilliance and the danger in Law's scheme, and he wanted to try it in Britain, but on a grander, more respectable scale. His pitch was bold. A new company, the South Sea Company, would take on a huge portion of Britain's national debt. In return, the government would grant it a monopoly on trade with the South Seas, that is, the coasts of Spanish-controlled South America. The company would make its money trading goods, gold, and slaves, while the government's debt would be slowly absorbed and repaid through the company's profits. Everyone would win, on paper at least. The plan sounded brilliant. Parliament approved it in 1711, and the South Sea Company was born. Its logo showed a proud ship sailing toward the horizon, symbolizing adventure, wealth, and empire. But there was one fatal flaw. Britain was at war with Spain. The South Seas, the very region the company was supposed to trade with, were controlled by Britain's enemy. The company's trading rights were, essentially, worthless. Yet that didn't matter, not yet. Because John Blunt wasn't really selling trade. He was selling trust. And trust, in 18th century London, was a currency far more powerful than gold. Blunt began recruiting investors. He used charm, mathematics, and patriotic rhetoric. He told them the South Sea Company was not just a business but a national solution, a way for Britain to rise from debt and show the world its financial genius. The company's first investors included nobles, generals, and even members of parliament. When King George I himself agreed to become the governor of the company, the illusion gained royal legitimacy. If the king was investing, how could it possibly go wrong? At first, it seemed to work. The government began transferring portions of its debt to the company in exchange for South Sea shares. Investors who owned government bonds could swap them for company stock, which paid dividends. Newspapers and pamphlets praised the patriotic genius of the plan. John Blunt was hailed as a financial hero. But Blunt knew something others didn't. The real profits weren't coming from trade, they were coming from speculation. He understood human psychology better than most. People didn't buy shares because of logic, they bought because of desire. They wanted to believe. So Blunt began to feed that belief. He organized parades, banquets, and even ceremonies where investors were publicly thanked as saviors of the nation. He painted pictures of ships returning loaded with silver and gold from the New World, ships that didn't actually exist. As investors poured in, the company's stock began to rise. At first modestly, from £100 to £200. Then faster. By 1719, as rumors of great wealth spread through coffeehouses and markets, South Sea shares climbed above £400. In early 1720, the company announced a new proposal. It would take over nearly the entire national debt, issuing even more shares to the public. The frenzy exploded. Everyone wanted a piece. By the summer of 1720, South Sea shares reached nearly £1,000 each, a tenfold increase in just months. London had gone mad. Rich and poor alike rushed to buy shares, convinced they were participating in the dawn of a new golden age. People sold their homes, pawned their jewelry, and borrowed money just to get in. Coffee houses became stock exchanges. Every conversation was about prices, profits, and dreams of sudden wealth. The South Sea Company became a religion, and John Blunt, its high priest. Even the Bank of England and other major institutions joined in. Parliament passed laws restricting other joint stock companies, ensuring that all the nation's speculation flowed into this one glorious bubble. And yet, behind the scenes, there was nothing. The company had almost no trade activity, no ships, no goods. Its profits came from selling its own shares to new investors, a perfect pyramid of greed. To keep prices high, the company even began lending money to people so they could buy more shares, driving prices up further in a self-reinforcing spiral. But as with all illusions, the moment of reckoning always comes. By late summer 1720, some of the insiders, those closest to John Blunt and Parliament, quietly began to sell their shares. They had made their fortunes and knew the truth: there was no gold coming from the South Seas. When whispers began to spread that the company's profits were imaginary, confidence started to crack. The price slipped from £950 to £700. Then £500. Then £300. Panic spread like fire through London. People who had borrowed to buy shares suddenly owed enormous debts. Bankers called in loans. Merchants couldn't pay suppliers. Families were ruined overnight. By the end of the year, South Sea stock had fallen below £150, and tens of thousands of investors were bankrupt. It was a catastrophe. The collapse of the South Sea bubble didn't just wipe out fortunes, it nearly destroyed Britain's economy. Banks failed, credit froze, and even the government's ability to function was threatened. The entire financial system, so proudly built, was on the verge of collapse. Parliament launched an inquiry, desperate to find someone to blame. What they discovered was worse than anyone imagined. Many of the nation's top leaders, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer John Illaby, had taken bribes, insider shares, and personal payments to promote the company. Some had sold their influence to keep the illusion alive while secretly cashing out. The corruption reached to the very heart of government. John Illaby was imprisoned. Other officials were forced to resign and surrender their wealth. The king's own mistresses were implicated. And John Blunt, the architect of the whole scheme, was ruined. His property was confiscated, his reputation destroyed, and his name forever cursed as a symbol of greed. But the damage couldn't be undone. Thousands of ordinary Britons had lost everything. Families that had been comfortable for generations were plunged into poverty. The phrase South Sea Bubble became synonymous with betrayal and delusion. The government passed new laws to restore public trust. The Bubble Act of 1720 was meant to prevent new joint stock companies from forming without royal approval, an early attempt at financial regulation. But it was a bandage on a bullet wound. The damage was psychological as much as financial. Britain had learned painfully that the human mind is the true battlefield of finance. And that's what makes the South Sea Bubble so terrifying, and so timeless. Because what happened in 1720 didn't stay there. It repeats. Over and over again. Look at the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s. Companies with no profits and barely any business model were valued at billions, simply because investors believed the internet would make everyone rich. When the illusion broke, trillions of dollars vanished. Or look at the 2008 financial crisis. Banks packaged worthless mortgages into complex investments and sold them as safe, government-backed assets. Just like the South Sea Company, they convinced the world that debt itself was wealth, until the truth surfaced and everything collapsed. And more recently, in the cryptocurrency boom of the 2020s, thousands of investors poured money into digital coins and NFTs. Many created overnight with no purpose, no product, no plan, only hype. Just like in 1720, people believed in the dream of infinite profit, until the illusion shattered. Different centuries. Different technologies. Same human weakness. The South Sea Bubble wasn't a financial failure. It was a psychological experiment. It revealed something about human nature that hasn't changed in 300 years, that when people believe they can get rich without effort, logic disappears. Emotion takes over. And no matter how educated or powerful they are, they fall for the same trap. Even the great scientist Isaac Newton was caught in the mania. He bought South Sea shares early, doubled his money, sold, and then, watching prices rise further, couldn't resist buying back in at the top. When the bubble burst, he lost £20,000, a fortune at the time. Newton later said, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men." That sentence still defines financial markets today. The South Sea Bubble marked the birth of modern speculation. It showed that markets don't move purely on data or logic, they move on stories, emotions, and collective belief. A single rumor can lift or destroy billions. The line between innovation and illusion is razor thin. So what can we learn from this? There are 3 lessons that remain as true today as they were in 1720. First, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Promises of guaranteed returns, government backing, or once-in-a-lifetime opportunities are almost always bait. In every bubble, there's a moment where emotion replaces evidence. That's the moment to stop, not to buy. Second, greed blinds intelligence. Education, experience, and power don't protect anyone from the lure of easy money. When everyone around you seems to be getting rich, it's almost impossible to stay rational. The crowd's excitement feels like proof, but it's usually the signal of a coming collapse. Third, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Every financial bubble follows the same emotional script: optimism, euphoria, delusion, panic, despair. The only difference is the setting. Once it was the South Sea, later it was railroads, dot-coms, real estate, crypto. The characters change. The story doesn't. 3 centuries after the South Sea bubble, we still haven't learned. Every generation believes it's different, that this time, the profits are real, the innovation is solid, and the old rules don't apply. But deep down, the same forces drive us: the desire to escape uncertainty, to believe in magic, to turn risk into certainty. The South Sea bubble didn't just bankrupt Britain. It revealed a flaw in human nature that still bankrupts dreams today. Because at its core, this wasn't a story about numbers. It was a story about people, about trust, greed, fear, and the eternal illusion that money can rewrite the laws of reality. And so, as you scroll through markets today, seeing prices soar and headlines promise easy wealth, remember this: every bubble begins with belief, and every crash begins with doubt. The question isn't whether another South Sea bubble will happen. The question is whether we'll recognize it before it bursts. If this story opened your eyes to how history repeats in the world of money, don't forget to subscribe and share it. Because the more we understand the past, the better chance we have of not living it again. And maybe, just maybe, when the next illusion appears on the horizon, you'll be able to see the ship for what it truly is: an empty vessel, sailing straight toward disaster.